All right, welcome to SDG 1, Unit 1. We're going to be talking about no poverty. This SDG, number 1 for a reason in the list of 17, calls on humanity to eliminate poverty. So that means that each of us has a role to play in alleviating this. The world was going in a direction where people were getting richer, frankly, getting richer and richer. That doesn't mean we were all rich. It just means that the economic situation of many countries was rising. Extreme poverty was lowering. And then COVID hit. The global pandemic really did a number on lots of countries' economies, from rich countries all the way to the most basic of developing countries. So everyone is sort of together in trying to climb back out of that hole. And poverty in all its forms anywhere, everywhere, we're going to discover that there are indeed different kinds of poverty. It doesn't just have to do with money. And we're going to talk about how you can have money and be poor. So let's begin with an overview. Myra Cohn Livingston wrote this short poem. Poor. I have heard of poor. It means hungry, no food, no shoes, no place to live, nothing good. It means winter nights and being cold. It is lonely, alone, feeling old. Poor is a tired face. Poor is thin. Poor is standing outside, looking in. Have you ever stood outside of a restaurant that you really wanted to go to, but you knew you could not afford it, and looked in the window and seen the wondrous things going on inside? For a lot of people who are impoverished, who have very little money, life is kind of like that. They are able to see other people driving around in cars, living in their own houses, having enough food to eat, all that kind of thing, but aren't able to participate in that. What is poverty? So these days, we sort of look to the all-knowing Wikipedia to help us make meaning out of certain things. Wikipedia says that poverty is the state of not having enough material possessions or income for a person's basic needs. Poverty may include social, economic, and political elements. Aha, 3 kinds of poverty. Absolute poverty is the complete lack of the means necessary to meet basic personal needs such as food, clothing, and shelter. Absolute poverty is also something that we call abject poverty. You'll hear this. Abject is a collocation with poverty, which means you'll often hear them together as a pair. We're going to talk about myths about poverty. We have so many surrounding this state of affairs, except we don't have to create a list of myths because we've got an article that talks all about them. And I'm going to provide a link from our Canvas site to this article, or if you're watching this on YouTube, it'll be down below. Here's the link. All right, let's talk about the number 1 myth concerning poverty. It's that those in poverty have only themselves to blame. People who believe this myth believe that people in poverty are lazy and unmotivated. They want to live off the government. So it's their fault. I think if we thought about it a little bit more, we'd realize that it's not their fault in most cases. That in most cases, people want to work, perhaps are working more than one or two jobs, but are not able to pull themselves out of the cycle of poverty. Number two, people in poverty are uneducated. If they just went to college, they wouldn't be poor. So this is a myth. You know, I forgot to mention how we create myths, how we create these things. A myth is something that you could call common sense. That doesn't mean it's true. It just means that it's something that goes unquestioned by people. So we never question, in the United States, for example, we drive on the right-hand side of the road. Other places drive on the left-hand side of the road, but we never question that. It's just what we call common sense. There are studies that say that driving on the left-hand side of the road saves lives. And there are studies that say that driving on the right-hand side of the road saves lives. But if you're in Japan or the UK, you'd better drive on the left. And if you're in the US, you'd better drive on the right. It's just something that is assumed and not questioned. The problem with myth creation is that the assumptions are usually based on faulty data or a lack of evidence or incorrect assumptions. So if you really spoke to people who are poor, if you really asked them about their backgrounds, I'm sure that you would find out that some of them have PhDs, right? Some of them have doctorates. Some of them have served as soldiers, maybe for many years. A lot of them have a great deal of job experience behind them. So these aren't simply people who haven't attained a high level of education. Poverty is equal opportunity, which in this case means it can strike anyone, anytime. Okay, myth number three, the US doesn't have much poverty. People think about countries like Japan, the US, China as rich, and therefore they wouldn't have a lot of poor people. But better for some always means worse for others. And what I mean by that is you can't have a rich person unless there are many, many poor people. Right? So the US actually does have a significant rate of poverty, as well as some extreme poverty. How about number four? Poverty is homeless people. Yeah, we can't equivocate these. It's true that homeless people usually have very little money, but there are lots of what you would call the working poor, people who are living paycheck to paycheck, an expression that we talked about in this unit. People who are trying very, very hard just to get by all the time. Okay, here's another one. Myth number five, getting a job is the key to preventing poverty. Folks, you can have 2 or 3 jobs and be poor sometimes. In this country, we have a minimum wage. Right now, it's hovering around $15 an hour. And after taxes, that's maybe $11 or $12 an hour that you're taking home. You can't even buy lunch with that much money. So having a job isn't necessarily going to prevent you from living in poverty, sadly. Okay, myth number 6, there's no link between health and poverty. There are a number of ways that you could look at this. One is that when you're in poverty, you often don't have access to healthcare, so your health is going to suffer. And then from the other angle, sometimes people who are leading normal lives, comfortable lives, have a developing medical situation and they can't afford their care. And so they lose things like their houses, their cars, etc., because they have to sell them to pay for this medical care. So there are a lot of connections between health and poverty. Number 7, there are no lasting effects on children who grow up in poverty. They have the same opportunities as children who do not live in poverty. So folks, one of the social aspects of poverty is that poor kids are discriminated against. The other kids in the school know that they are poor and maybe make fun of them or exclude them from activities, social groups, stuff like that. The effects of poverty don't end. Imagine a kid who grows up in poverty and then luckily gets to go to school, go to college, have a good post-college job, maybe a family, maybe a house. And is that it? Is everything all better then? No. The effects of growing up in poverty continue. It's actually very hard to get out of the cycle of poverty, what we call a vicious circle, and get into what's called a virtuous circle or virtuous cycle because of these lasting effects. Okay, did you know that the United States has what we call a poverty level? The poverty level is around, if you're a person who makes around $13,000 per year, that's 13000, then you are officially at the poverty line. So myth number 8 claims that if you're not officially poor, you're doing okay. So if you make $14,000 a year, you are not at the US government designated poverty level, but you're also not too comfortable. With that amount of money, I can't imagine being able to pay for an apartment, phone, food, utilities, blah, 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 all these kinds of things that we need to have these days. It's for people who are very, very good at being careful with their money, they can probably do it, but not always. And it does put us into a place, back to the vicious cycle again. It does put them in a place where if one thing goes wrong, if some emergency happens, they can quickly become homeless because there's no buffer of extra money, right? And they can sink deeper into poverty. So it's not enough to just not be officially poor. All right, number 9, handouts will bankrupt us. People who are sort of on the political right of the spectrum, in this country at least, have a low tolerance for helping people out who have less means than we do. It's probably because they believe the myth. Have you ever heard of the American dream? It's the idea that the same opportunities are available to everyone. And if you just work hard enough, you'll get what you want. Well, it is what it's called. It's a dream, right? Because of different economic policies that we impose upon our citizens, we don't always have the same opportunities, even if it may seem that we do. So the idea that handouts will bankrupt us, back in the 20th century, we started the social security system. We started social welfare, all these sorts of things that, every developed country has. And in fact, we, as a nation, we give out less assistance to our poor than other poorer nations do. We haven't gone bankrupt yet. Okay, what about number 10? This is maybe the biggest myth. We saved it for last. It doesn't affect me. I'll never be poor. Back in 2020, when the coronavirus pandemic hit the world, there were a number of people, a huge number of people, I should say, working in service positions like waiters, waitresses, servers, what am I trying to say? Other support staff in restaurants who were hit very, very hard by this because often restaurants closed and did not reopen. If I walk around downtown down here, some of my favorite restaurants closed and just never came back. So what happened to those people? They still had to pay their rent. They still had to make their car payment. They still had to buy food, all those kinds of things. But they couldn't do it, and they couldn't secure new employment in the same field. Some jobs like tending bar or serving customers can pay pretty well, because of the tipping culture in the United States. But if that's suddenly cut off and you don't have a lot of money in savings, voila, you're poor. You're instantly poor. So we can never really anticipate what's going to happen in the future. I know you guys know that already. But this myth is pervasive. If I grew up comfortably, then certainly I'll be comfortable when I'm older. Yeah, tomorrow is guaranteed to no one. All right, now we're going to move into some breakout groups, breakout rooms, and talk with our student assistant conversation partners about why these myths are not true. Okay, so what we need to do is do some research on the internet and in the article that I've linked to several times on Canvas and once in this slideshow presentation, which will also be available on Canvas. And we need to find out where the myths fail us. Why are they wrong? Okay, there's an assignment for today that has to do with exactly this. So please do complete that, and then we'll move on to the next unit. All right.